The wind came first, long before the light, drifting down from the high ridges like a voice too old to remember itself. It carried pine resin and cold, the sting of winter not yet fully born, but close enough to make breath shiver on the lips. Snow lay thin and patchy over the earth, the kind that dusted tree roots and stuck to wagon wheels, but had not yet drowned the world in silence. Out in those woods, everything waited. The deer had pulled back into thickets, the wolves padded softer, and the river's song was already slowing beneath a thin crust of ice. It was the season when men hardened, women pulled shawls tighter, and children dreamed of fires they rarely touched. And in that fragile hour before sunrise, when frost still clung like a veil to the valley, a child walked alone. She was 5 years old, her small frame wrapped in a thin dress the color of faded cornflour, the hem stiff from dirt and wear. Her cheeks were apple red from the cold, her lips chapped, her tiny hands trembling around the edge of a frayed wool shawl that barely covered her shoulders. Every step left shallow prints in the brittle frost. Her name was Mary Beth, and though her eyes were wide with fear, she walked as though something behind her hurt worse than the winter ahead. The cabin appeared like a shadow half-born from the trees. Logs darkened by age, roof sagging beneath patches of moss, smoke slipping faintly from a crooked chimney. It looked deserted to those who did not know better, a forgotten refuge left behind by those who had moved on. But Mary Beth had been told of the man who lived there. The whispers from town called him savage, outlaw, a ghost of the old Apache wars. She did not know what savage meant. She only knew her mama had told her, in a voice trembling and thin, that when no one else would help, sometimes the ones you feared were the only ones left. Mary Beth reached the rough-hewn door. Her hand hovered, knuckles pale. She bit her lip, then struck against the wood with the softest knock, as if afraid her own sound might echo too loud and call the world's anger down upon her. For a moment there was only the hush of trees and the rasp of her own breath. Then the door creaked, slow as if time itself resisted. He stood framed by the dim interior, the morning wind brushing across his bare chest. The man was tall, shoulders broad enough to fill the doorway. His hair was dark, long, braided with bits of leather that swung gently as he moved. The lines of his face were carved deep, not by age but by years of sun and war. His eyes held a silence that was not emptiness but weight, the kind of silence that remembered things no one else wanted to speak aloud. Mary Beth's knees quivered, but her voice broke through the cold. "They beat my mama," she whispered, the words tangled with a sob. "She's in too much pain." The man did not speak. His gaze flicked to the shawl slipping from her shoulders, to the raw skin on her hands, to the bruises faintly blooming along her wrist. Then he stepped aside, the door opening wider, a gesture that was neither welcome nor refusal, but something in between. Mary Beth's small frame swayed, caught between fear and hope. She swallowed hard and pointed back toward the trees. Her mama lay not far, beside the wagon half splintered by the road, too broken to walk, too shamed to cry for the town's help. For the first time, the Apache spoke, his voice low, rough as stone against water. "Where?" The single word, heavy with the accent of another tongue, carried more weight than whole sermons in the church at town. Mary Beth turned, her tiny boots crunching on frost, and he followed, silent, shirtless despite the bite in the air. They moved through the forest's stillness. The girl half ran, half stumbled, her breath visible in clouds. Behind her, the man's steps were soundless, his presence too large for the narrow trail, yet somehow blending with the woods themselves. When they reached the clearing, the sight weighted like a wound. Beside the wagon lay Ruth Ann, Mary Beth's mother. 28 years old, her face once fair with the softness of peach skin, now marred by bruises blossoming along cheek and jaw. Her hair, the color of wheat left too long in the sun, tangled around her shoulders. Her body curled against the cold, one arm clutched tight across her ribs as though holding herself together. Her lips were split, her breath shallow. She opened her eyes when the crunch of steps drew near, and fear leapt into them before anything else. Ruth Ann tried to rise, but pain pinned her down. Her gaze darted to the man behind her daughter. She knew him, or rather, she knew of him. The whispers that clung to his name, Tawa. The giant Apache, said to live apart from his people and apart from the settlers, too wild for one, too weary for the other. Some claimed he had blood on his hands from raids, others that he had been cast out by his own kin. No one spoke of him with gentleness. "Please, Mama." Mary Beth dropped to her knees, clutching her mother's hand. "He'll help us." Ruth Ann's lips parted, but no words came. Only shame filled her eyes. Shame for the bruises, for the weakness, for lying broken where any passerby might see. Shame for sending her daughter into the woods to beg at the door of a man the town spat upon. Tawa crouched beside her. His hand, large and rough with scars, brushed lightly along her ribs where the bruises lay dark beneath her dress. She flinched, but he did not press. He only looked at her, then at the little girl, and then at the wagon as though calculating the distance between cruelty and mercy. He said nothing more. Instead he bent, slipping one arm beneath Ruth Ann's shoulders, the other beneath her knees. She gasped, a cry escaping before she could smother it, but he lifted her with ease, rising into the frosted air as though bearing not a burden but a vow. Mary Beth hurried after them, shawl flapping like a broken wing. Her small hands clutched the hem of his leather trousers, as if tethering herself to the moment. Back through the trees they went, the sun not yet risen, the world still wrapped in blue-gray shadow. Ruth Ann's head lolled against his chest, her eyes drifting between pain and disbelief. She had never been carried before, not in kindness. Each step jarred her ribs, yet some deeper part of her loosened, as though the weight of being seen and not mocked was heavier than the bruises themselves. At the cabin door, Tawa kicked aside the latch and carried her inside. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a dying fire. The air smelled of cedar smoke, leather and herbs. A cot lined with rough furs lay against one wall, a table scattered with tools and a carved wooden bowl at its center. He set her down gently, covering her with a heavy blanket. Then he turned, stirring the fire with an iron rod until sparks leapt and flames stretched higher. Mary Beth climbed onto the cot beside her mother, her small body pressed against Ruth Ann's arm. Tawa moved without hurry but with certainty. From a shelf he took dried leaves, ground them into powder with a stone, mixed them with water in the wooden bowl. His hands were precise, steady. He brought the mixture to Ruth Ann's lips, but she turned her face, shame tightening her jaw. "I can't," she whispered hoarsely, "it isn't proper." Mary Beth's little voice cut through, fierce despite the tremble. "Mama, please." For a long breath, Ruth Ann hesitated. Then, eyes fluttering closed, she drank. The bitterness of the herbs filled her mouth, but warmth followed, sliding down her throat like a promise she did not trust. Tawa sat back, watching her as though studying a map written in bruises. He did not speak again. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackle of fire, and the girl's small, steady breaths. Outside, the first rays of morning broke across the snow. And miles away at the sight of the wagon, Elias, the man who had beaten Ruth Ann, returned. He found the ground empty save for the prints in frost. His eyes narrowed, jaw set with fury. He spat into the dirt and called for his brothers. By the time Ruth Ann drifted into uneasy sleep, Elias's oath had already been spoken. He would find her. He would drag her back. And the man who dared touch what he called his own would pay. But in the cabin, Mary Beth clutched her wooden shawl tighter, her cheek against her mother's arm, and for the first time in her small life, she did not cry herself to sleep. And Tawa, staring into the fire, knew that by letting them in, he had opened the door not just to two fragile lives, but to the storm already stirring beyond the trees. The cold deepened as the days slipped by, tightening its grip on the valley, until the air itself seemed carved from glass. Smoke curled steadier now from the crooked chimney of the cabin, proof of life where most believed there was only wilderness. Inside, warmth fought a fragile battle against the winter, though Ruth Ann often felt the frost linger in her bones no matter how close she sat to the fire. Her body bore bruises like ink stains on parchment, fading at the edges but deep in their core. Each breath reminded her of Elias's fists, the way his voice cut sharper than any whip, the way his brothers laughed as if her pain were a tavern jest. Mary Beth remained near her side, seldom leaving her lap except to toddle around the cabin, tracing her fingers along the wooden tools and dried herbs that hung from rafters. She had begun to laugh again, not loudly, but small bursts like bells in the distance. It startled Ruth, and sometimes that laughter. It felt too bright for the world she knew, as though some trick of fate had placed it here, only to remind her how much she had lost. And then there was the man. Tawa moved about the cabin like a shadow in flesh. His steps had no sound, though he was large enough to make the beams creak when he stooped. He rarely spoke, yet every action carried meaning. The way he stirred herbs into boiling water, the way he set aside a portion of venison for Mary Beth before he ate, the way he left space around Ruth, and as though respect itself had built an invisible wall he would not cross. She did not trust him, not fully, but each day in his care made her question the lines that had been drawn for her by others. Her mind returned again and again to Elias. She could still see his face, twisted with rage when the wagon wheel splintered, and she begged him to rest. She remembered the slap, the shove that sent her sprawling, the boot that struck until the world blurred. She remembered Mary Beth's tiny cry, and how Elias snarled at the child to hush or feel the same. That was when shame had outweighed fear, when she whispered to Mary Beth to run for the cabin the town called cursed. It was the last strength she had, sending her daughter away to beg the mercy of a stranger. Now she sat by the fire, ribs bound with Tawa's rough cloth strips, fingers trembling as she tried to thread a needle into torn fabric. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke to him. "Why would you help us?" He was crouched near the hearth, feeding pine into the flames. His head turned, braids shifting over his shoulders. For a long time, he gave no answer. Then, in that gravel tone of his, he said only, "Because you asked." The simplicity of it cut deeper than sermons she had heard in church. She lowered her eyes, ashamed of tears that stung without permission. In town, whispers had already begun to stir. Widow Maureen was the first to speak them loudly. Folks said she saw Ruth Ann's wagon broken by the roadside, the tracks leading into the woods. She told others that the settler's wife had run off, taken up with the Apache, abandoned decency. By the time the tale circled the tavern, it had grown sharp as knives. Ruth Ann had chosen savagery over her own people. Children mocked Mary Beth's name. Women shook their heads with practiced pity. Men muttered that Elias was wronged, his pride trampled. None spoke of bruises. None asked what had driven her into the snow. Elias himself roared louder than all. He stood in the tavern doorway with his brothers Jed and Amos at either side, his jaw swollen with rage. They were men carved from the same hard grain. Jed heavy-shouldered and mean-eyed, Amos lanky but quick with fists. They drank deep, spat curses, swore vengeance. Elias swore he would have his wife back before winter was done, no matter whose blood paved the way. The brothers laughed, boasting of what they'd do to the heathen, who dared touch what belonged to them. But beneath the laughter was a thread of fear, for all men had heard the stories of Tawa, the giant who lived alone. Back in the cabin, Ruth Ann tried to rise from the cot one morning, her hand pressed to her ribs. Tawa set down the knife he was sharpening and moved quickly to steady her. She flinched at the sudden closeness, old habit more than choice. "I must," she whispered, "I can't just lie here." He guided her gently back against the furs. His eyes met hers, steady, unyielding. Rest. It was not command, but care wrapped in stone. And for reasons she could not name, she obeyed. Mary Beth climbed into her lap, her little fingers clutching Ruth Ann's hand. "You don't have to go, Mama. He'll keep us safe." The word struck like a church bell in her chest. Safe. It was a word she had not believed in for years, not in Elias's house, not in the town where pity weighed heavier than compassion. She brushed a strand of hair from Mary Beth's cheek, wondering if a child's hope could see something she herself was blind to. Night fell heavy, bringing with it dreams Ruth Ann could not escape. She dreamed of Elias's fists, of Jed's mocking laughter, of Amos's sneer as they called her weak. She woke with sweat on her brow, the fire low, and saw Tawa seated against the wall, his knife laid across his lap, his eyes open and fixed on the door as though he had not slept at all. For the first time, she realized his silence was not distance, it was vigilance. He was watching not her, but the world outside, guarding against footsteps that might one day come. Still, fear clung like frost. She remembered Elias's vows, the way he claimed her like property. She whispered into the dark, almost without meaning to, "He'll come for me." Tawa did not turn his head. His voice was steady, like stone in riverbed. "Then let him." Days folded into one another. Ruth Ann's strength returned slowly. She managed to sew her torn dress, to brush Mary Beth's hair by the fire, to help prepare a meal though her hands trembled. Every small task felt like defiance against the life Elias had forced upon her. Each time she faltered, Tawa was there, not with words but with presence. He split wood until the pile grew high. He set snares in the woods, bringing back rabbits. He carved Mary Beth a doll from cedar, the shape rough but loved all the same. In his silence, Ruth Ann found an odd comfort, as though she no longer needed to explain her worth to be permitted to exist. But beyond the forest's edge, the cruelty she fled gathered like storm clouds. Elias and his brothers prepared. They polished their rifles, drank their courage, told the town they would take back what was theirs. Some men cheered them, others turned away, but no one stepped forward to speak of Ruth Ann's bruises. The truth of her suffering was quieter than the pride of men. One evening, as the wind howled down the chimney and the fire burned low, Ruth Ann sat watching Tawa mend a broken handle. She found her voice unsteady when she asked, "Why do you live alone?" His hands paused. His eyes lifted, dark as mountain stone. He said nothing for a long time, then returned to his work. Because silence does not betray. The answer was raw, heavy with histories she could not touch. She wanted to ask more, but his expression closed like a door. Yet something in her chest shifted. She understood then that the man the world called savage had known betrayal deep enough to make exile a home. She reached for Mary Beth's hand, holding it tight. Her daughter was humming softly, a tune from before the pain. For a moment Ruth Ann allowed herself to breathe. The cabin, with its smoke-stained rafters and scarred floorboards, felt safer than any church pew she had ever sat upon. But safety in such a world was borrowed time. Far across the woods, under a sky heavy with cloud, Elias spat into the dirt beside the dying fire. His brothers leaned close, rifles gleaming in the moonlight. They had found tracks leading toward the ridge, wide footprints too large to be Ruth Ann's or Mary Beth's. Jed grinned with teeth yellow from tobacco. "We'll find them soon enough." Elias's eyes burned, colder than the frost creeping into the earth. He would not rest until he dragged her back, until he crushed the defiance in her, until he proved to every gossip in town that no woman of his would shame him by running to the arms of another. His voice rasped into the night. "She's mine. And the savage will learn it." Back at the cabin, the wind rattled the shutters, and Ruth Ann stirred in uneasy sleep. Tawa sat awake once more, knife across his lap, listening to the forest. He heard the wolves' distant howl, the groan of pines in the wind, the small breath of a child safe for now. Yet in the silence between he heard something else, the faintest echo of footsteps carried on memory, a warning of cruelty drawing near. And in that moment, he knew the knock on his door had been more than a child's plea. It had been the opening of a war he could not turn away from. The days lengthened in silence, though winter pressed down harder with each sunrise. Snow no longer dusted the ground in fleeting veils but settled thick, muffling the woods until every sound seemed stolen by the white hush. The cabin became a world of its own, its logs groaning under wind, its chimney sending up a thin, stubborn thread of smoke. Inside, the fire grew to a heartbeat, steady and constant, its glow washing Ruth Ann and Mary Beth in warmth they had not known in months. Ruth Ann moved with more strength now. Her ribs still ached when she reached too high. Her lip carried a faint scar, but color had returned to her cheeks, soft as peach bloom. She sat by the fire and mended clothes with hands that no longer shook. Her stitches were uneven, but the rhythm of needle and thread steadied her spirit, made her feel less like a ghost. Mary Beth sat close by, playing with the cedar doll Tawa had carved. She gave the figure a name, whispered secrets to it, wrapped it in scraps of cloth as though it were her own child. In those whispers Ruth Ann heard something she thought had died. Innocence, uncrushed by cruelty. Tawa remained mostly silent. He worked with the discipline of one who needed no words to justify his existence. Each morning he split wood, his muscles rolling under scarred skin, each strike of the axe echoing through the frozen air. He returned with rabbits caught in snares or fish pulled from the half-frozen creek. At night he tended to his tools by firelight, knife in hand, braids falling forward as sparks flickered against his features. His presence was not demanding. He did not reach for Ruth and did not claim her space, yet she felt him there like the steady weight of stone at her back. She found herself watching him. At first it was suspicion, then curiosity, then something else she dared not name. She had known men who shouted, who filled a room with anger, who broke the silence with cruelty. Tawa's quiet unsettled her at first. It was not weakness but restraint, and restraint was foreign to her. When he did speak, his words carried the gravity of rivers, simple but carved deep. She began to measure her own breath by them. The town, though, did not rest in such quiet. Rumors spread thick as the smoke from their chimneys. Widow Maureen fanned them with her sharp tongue, claiming she had seen Ruth and enter the Apache's home willingly. Others nodded, eager to believe shameful tales. Children at the well mimicked Marybeth's name in cruel tones. Some men spat Elias's name with sympathy, claiming no husband should bear such insult. Not one voice asked what Ruth had endured before she left. Pride and gossip drowned truth like stones in a well. Ruth feared the whispers even in the cabin's safety. She imagined the town's faces, the condemnation in their eyes. Yet in moments, when Marybeth laughed or when Tawa quietly set a bowl of stew before her without meeting her gaze, she felt dignity stir inside her like embers long buried. Dignity, she realized, was not something given by a husband or a town. It was something reclaimed in silence, in small breaths where no one struck her down. One evening, as snow tapped against the shutters and the fire painted their faces gold, Ruth dared to speak. She asked Tawa how he learned to heal wounds with herbs. His eyes lifted from the knife he sharpened, studying her as though weighing whether she deserved the answer. Finally, he said, "My mother's hands." Then he looked back to his blade, and no more words followed. The simplicity of it ached. A man most called savage had learned gentleness from a mother's hands, carried it still though war and exile had hollowed him. Ruth bowed her head, tears catching her lashes, not for herself but for the truth she glimpsed. That dignity could be born of suffering, carried even when the world stripped everything else. Marybeth began to sleep more soundly, curling with her doll under furs. Sometimes Ruth woke in the night and found Tawa seated by the door, his knife across his lap, watching. At first she thought it was mistrust, that he feared she would flee. But one night she rose, blanket drawn about her, and realized his eyes were not on her at all. They were on the door, on the darkness beyond it, on the wolves and the footsteps he alone expected. He was guarding them. She lay awake long after, staring at the beams of the roof, her chest heavy. For years she had thought of safety as a dream for others, something she was too weak to earn. Now, under the roof of a man feared by the world, she felt it for the first time. And it frightened her more than danger, for she did not know if she deserved it. As days passed, her hands found work again. She cooked with him, her fingers brushing his as they passed bowls, though neither spoke of it. She washed Marybeth's dress in the icy creek, teeth chattering, while Tawa stood nearby, breaking ice with his staff so the water could flow. Their lives began to thread together, not by declaration but by necessity, by gestures too quiet for others to see. And in those gestures Ruth felt a slow bloom of something unnamed. Yet danger thickened. Elias and his brothers had traced the prints in snow, followed the rumors like hounds. They gathered in the tavern at night, their laughter loud, their threats louder. Elias's pride was raw, his shame deeper than any bruise he had given. Jed urged him to strike soon. Amos, crueler still, promised to drag Ruth back by her hair. The town turned its eyes away, for no one wished to quarrel with three men so eager for blood. One afternoon Ruth stood outside the cabin, the shawl around her shoulders, watching the sun sink behind pines. Tawa was chopping wood. Each swing of the axe rang sharp, clean. She found herself whispering, "Thank you." He paused, axe resting in the block. His dark eyes rose to hers, unreadable. She thought he might turn away, but he only nodded once. It was enough. In that nod lay recognition, not of debt, but of her dignity slowly returning. That night, Marybeth asked if they could stay forever. Her voice was small, drowsy with sleep. Ruth stroked her hair, heart heavy with the knowledge that forever was a word winter could not promise. But she kissed her daughter's brow and said, "We are safe tonight." And in her heart, She prayed it was true. The snowstorm broke the next morning. Fierce winds howled, rattling the cabin, snow driven sideways through the trees. Ruth sat by the fire, mending again, while Tawa barred the shutters. Mary Beth built a little fort of blankets, her laughter muffled but bright. For a brief span of hours, they were only a family, strange, fragile but whole. But storm and silence carried warnings. In the tavern, Elias slammed his fist on the table. He would not wait longer. With Jed and Amos at his side, he strapped rifles across their backs, pulled coats over their shoulders, and set out into the white. Their footprints bit deep into snow, 3 shadows cutting toward the cabin. Inside, Tawa lifted his head. He had felt the shift before it arrived, the way a man born to war feels the tremor in the air. Ruth watched him, fear coiling her breath. He set the knife down, slow and certain, his gaze moving to the door. For the first time since she had entered his cabin, Ruth understood. They had been living in borrowed time. And the debt was coming due. Snow drove sideways through the trees, hissing against bark, erasing paths as quickly as they were made. The storm howled across the valley, swallowing sound, but not enough to cover the crunch of boots pressing deep into white. Elias led the way, his jaw tight, his breath steaming through clenched teeth. Behind him trudged Jed, broad and heavy, his rifle strapped to his back, and Amos, wiry and twitching, a cruel grin bent across his lips despite the cold that gnawed at their ears. Each step drew them closer to the cabin hidden in the woods, the one they cursed in tavern whispers but dared now to approach with fists and guns, because Elias's pride burned hotter than fear. Inside the cabin, firelight glowed golden against the walls, the warmth fierce against the storm's rattling fingers. Ruth sat stiff by the hearth, needle poised mid-stitch but thread unmoving, her heart pacing faster than her hand could work. Mary Beth slept beneath blankets near the cot, the cedar doll clasped close against her chest, her small breaths steady in dream. Tawa stood by the door, knife at his hip, shoulders set like stone against the wooden frame. His dark eyes did not blink as he stared into the flickering shadows, listening, feeling, knowing before any sound reached that danger was already climbing the ridge. Ruth Ann's whisper broke. "They're coming." Tawa's gaze flicked to her, steady, unflinching. He said nothing. He did not need to. The truth was already in the firelight, written in the silence between crackling logs. The first knock was not a knock at all but a pounding, fist slamming would so hard the door shuddered on its hinges. The storm's roar bled into the room as Elias's voice cut through, harsh and raw. "Ruth Ann, you come out now." Mary Beth stirred, blinking, her little face pressed against her doll. Ruth rushed to hush her, hands trembling, fear pressing down like the weight of years of beatings. Her lips shaped words without breath. "Stay quiet." Another strike on the door, heavier. Amos's voice joined, cruel and mocking. "Don't hide, girl. Don't think that redskin can keep you." Tawa's hand closed on the knife. He breathed once, deep, and then opened the door. The storm screamed into the cabin, snow swirling across the threshold. Elias stood just beyond, his hat rim rimmed with ice, his eyes wild with drink and fury. Behind him loomed Jed with his rifle, and Amos with a pistol twitching in his hand. Their shapes seemed carved from shadow and snow, ghosts of cruelty given flesh. "She's mine," Elias spat, stepping forward. "You think you can steal her? You think she belongs to you?" Tawa's silence answered. His body filled the doorway, blocking them from entering, his chest bare and steaming in the bitter air. Ruth clutched Mary Beth closer, every bruise on her body, remembering the truth Elias spat. But something inside her stirred against it, something she had almost lost. She whispered, voice trembling but sure, "No more." Elias's head jerked, eyes snapping to her. His fury rose like flame in oil. He shoved forward, but Tawa's arm caught him square, sending him stumbling back into the snow. Jed snarled, pulling his rifle from his shoulder. Amos raised his pistol, lips twisted. The world snapped into motion. Jed swung the rifle like a club, but Tawa moved with a swiftness that defied his size. His knife flashed, knocking the barrel aside, then his elbow struck Jed's chest, sending him reeling. Amos fired, the shot cracking through storm and night, shattering a log on the hearth behind Ruth Ann. Sparks sprayed the cabin, fire leaping higher in fright. Mary Beth cried out, clutching tighter to her doll. Ruth Ann shielded her daughter with her own body, heart pounding, the scream of gunpowder pulling every memory of Elias's blows back to life. But then she saw Tawa, moving, steady, rooted like oak against storm. He seized Amos's wrist, twisted until the pistol clattered into snow, then struck with the hilt of his knife. Amos crumpled, blood spilling down his lip. Jed roared, charging again, but Tawa met him head-on, driving him back with strength that rattled even the heavy man's bones. They crashed into the drifts, snow exploding beneath their weight. The fight was not wild but deliberate, every strike measured, every movement born from years of violence endured and survived. Elias hung back, fury twisting into fear as he watched his brothers falter. His pride screamed, but his body remembered too well the stories whispered in taverns about the Apache, who fought like shadow and flame. Still, shame cut deeper than fear, and he lunged forward, shouting Ruth Ann's name like a curse. She rose then, clutching Mary Beth close, her breath tearing in her throat. For the first time, she did not cower. She met his eyes through the storm-filled doorway, and spoke words she never thought she'd speak. "I am not yours." The words struck harder than Tawa's blows, harder than any knife. Elias faltered, his face contorted, rage breaking into disbelief. He shouted back, "You're my wife. You're mine." But his voice wavered under the truth she held. Jed fell hard into the snow, Tawa's knife at his throat. Amos groaned in the drift, clutching his broken lip. Only Elias stood, his breath shaking, his body trembling between pride and terror. Tawa did not move toward him. He only stood tall in the storm, his chest rising steady, his eyes black as mountain stone. His silence carried more judgment than any jury could. Elias's breath came ragged. He stepped back once, twice, then turned and fled into the white, his curses fading into the howl of wind. Jed scrambled after, Amos limping close behind. Their shadows vanished into storm, leaving only blood and trampled snow behind. Silence followed, heavy and sharp. The fire in the hearth cracked, throwing sparks against the shadows. Ruth Ann sank to her knees, clutching Mary Beth so tight the girl squeaked. Tears blurred her eyes, not from fear now, but from the weight lifted from her chest, heavier than any bruise Elias had left. Tawa stepped back inside, snow melting down his shoulders, his knife streaked with crimson. He set it down by the hearth without a word. His chest rose once, deep, then steadied. Ruth Ann lifted her gaze to him, trembling. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. All that came was a whisper, "Thank you." He did not answer, but his eyes softened, just slightly, as he turned back to the fire. The storm raged outside, wind clawing at the walls, but inside, the cabin glowed. Ruth Ann sat with Mary Beth curled against her chest, the doll pressed between them. Her breath steadied, her heart finding a rhythm she thought long lost. For the first time, she believed they might see a dawn without fear. Tawa crouched by the fire, feeding logs into its heart. The flames leapt, warming the room, painting his skin in gold and shadow. Ruth Ann watched him, her hand stroking Mary Beth's hair, her eyes lingering longer than fear allowed. She saw not just the warrior who had driven back cruelty, but the man who had given her silence without judgment, who had carried her when she could not stand, who had guarded them through storm and shame alike. And in that firelight, she felt something stir. Not swift, not sudden but slow, like roots pushing beneath frozen ground. Outside, the storm buried tracks, erasing proof of the violence that had passed. But Ruth Ann knew Elias was not gone. Pride that deep did not die in a single night. He would return, she feared, with vengeance heavier still. Yet for now in this fragile hush, she allowed herself to breathe in dignity. Mary Beth stirred, mumbling in her sleep, then settled again. Ruth Ann kissed her hair, eyes never leaving the fire. Tawa turned, his gaze meeting hers across the flicker of flame. No words passed. None were needed. And in that silence, Ruth Ann understood. The reckoning was not over. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm yet to come.